Story time. Did you know that Google Workspace helped Apple grow their market share in the enterprise? I'm going to cover some of the backstory on how that happened in this video. Hi, my name is Pete Moriarty, and we help businesses systemize, organize, and scale using Google Workspace. If you're interested in more, check out our channel. We've got heaps of videos on everything to do with small and medium-sized businesses, helping you get your tech right. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the relationship with Google in the workplace and Apple. And I started working with computers when I was literally 15 years old, nearly 20 years ago now. And I helped businesses get organizations set up with Mac hardware pretty early on. Now, that's because I came from a Mac family. My parents had Macs, I had Macs. And then when I entered the technology space, workforce and technology consulting space, I noticed that most of the technology consultants were very Microsoft heavy, but I'd always been a Mac guy. Now, that was a little bit radical around 2009, 2010 when I started my business, because around that time, Macs were mostly kind of like the prosumer market, or used in very high-end business applications like design, architecture, and think like, graphic design or video editing kind of things. Most businesses would still be using Microsoft, but because the iPhone had just been released, I think around 2007 it first came out, there was this big kind of resurgence of Apple as a brand, and consumers started to using Apple for everything, and then they started buying Apple computers more and more and more as well. And so this big kind of wave happened, and I'm going to talk about some of what happened in the background of that. Now, what we've always known is that technology in the consumer world really influences technology in the business world. And that's why we see applications like WhatsApp and Messenger and even Snapchat influencing how business tools are used. We had business owners who were using Facebook Messenger and WhatsApp in their personal lives, then want to go to work and have instant messaging applications which were as easy to use, if not easier to use. And that's how applications like Slack became very popular, and then Google Chat and Microsoft Teams as well. And everyone kind of followed suit, typically following what the consumer technology world is doing and bringing that into the business world. Now, technology is deeply personal for many people, and so if you have, for example, millennial staff employed in your business and they're used to having a very easeful experience in the consumer world, well, they're going to expect that their business tools have the same level of functionality, of flexibility, of ease of use, and they're going to demand that you have those kind of tools available in your business. And this is where Google comes in. Google obviously have been a very strong consumer brand since the early 2000s, and with Google's Gmail application, which then, in the late 2000s began starting to be built out into Google Docs, and then eventually Google Drive, and Calendar was there pretty early on as well. All of these different apps started to become more and more viable for the business world. Now, in the background, Google was originally called, I think, Google Domains, and then Google for Business, and then Google Apps, and then G Suite, and then Workspace. I may have missed one of the rebrands. There's been so many rebrands over the years. And this application, which initially started as just literally email and calendar, and then had some very basic documents, which Google didn't even build. They actually acquired the company that had the documents and the sheets. Eventually, Google's built that into a productivity powerhouse, which covers all kinds of business tools and all kinds of business uses. Well, if you think about it, at the same time, we have the history of Microsoft. And at that time, Microsoft was very centric around servers. They had their Active Directory technology, which was their directory of users, and that would control things like permissions. It would control computers. It would control, screening of security and that kind of thing. It would control sharing printers and other network resources. And typically in a business, you would have individual computers sitting on people's desks, and you'd have a server system, and that would actually house and hold on to the data, because you'd put big hard drives in the server, and then you'd just back up the server, and everyone would kind of work off the server as their shared drives. And that meant that people could collaborate. If someone needed to dial in from outside the office, they would use a VPN or remote desktop and dial in, and that's how businesses worked. But obviously very server-centric and very centric around this idea of Active Directory. Now, Microsoft started to build out more and more and more tools. Obviously Office has been around forever, but Microsoft eventually put Microsoft Exchange, which is their email server product, into the cloud, and they rebranded it and called it Office 365. Effectively, it was still a version of hosted Exchange, and you'd still have to install Outlook on your computer and connect to the remote Exchange, which is still the same way it works right now. Crazy, but it is. But effectively, yes, you had Exchange living either on a server or in the cloud, you had Outlook running on your desktop, and you had, the rest of the Microsoft suite running on your desktop as well. Now, in the early days, there weren't really many decent file sharing applications. You'd have to use something like Dropbox or another file sharing application. If you wanted to share things in the Microsoft world, you were stuck using SharePoint and like connecting SharePoint up to a network drive on your My Computer, which was an absolute mess. The original OneDrive was a mess for years and years and years. About the first 5 or 6 years, it was completely unusable. And I think many businesses still use something like Dropbox Enterprise these days just because OneDrive was so bad and it hurt so many people. But then Google came along. Google comes along, they launch apps, it starts to build, they added Docs, they added all the other bits and pieces, and then eventually they added Drive. And Drive was really a turning point because that was around the time where in the early kind of like 2010s decade, where businesses started doing everything on the cloud and started to think about, well, why do we need this server anymore if I can do everything online? If my bookkeeping is online with Xero.com, if my documents are online with Google Docs, if I've got my files stored online in Google Drive, and then everything else I'm doing is effectively on the web, well, why on earth would I need a server? And literally the last things that people were keeping servers for were credentials on individual desktops and maybe, pushing down an antivirus to the individual machines. It would still handle updates as well, and then it would handle printer sharing, and that was about it. And so bit by bit, we saw as internet connections started getting fast enough for everything to be online. Eventually, businesses stopped using tools like SharePoint. They stopped using servers and effectively started putting everything online. Now, how did that help Apple? Well, what we saw was that at the time it was called Google Apps were much, much easier to work on your iPhone. If you wanted to connect up to something like Microsoft Exchange, you'd have to use the Apple app on your phone and put in the IMAP server or the MAPI server or the SMTP server and configure all those kind of things manually. Whereas Google had one easy button, you could just click the Gmail button and automatically sign straight into your Gmail, which made it really easy to configure iPhones in the enterprise. Because Apple also had a very consistent experience with their operating system, it meant that it was easy to roll out fleets of phones and use mobile device management software. Early versions of that were things like AirWatch, which would allow you to actually manage and deploy policies onto the mobile phones right from a central cloud-based location. Now, nowadays, you can do that right inside of Google Workspace with Google's mobile device management, which is built right in for free, which is very cool. But in the old days, you'd use a separate app for that. Now, what we saw happening in the small business space was that entrepreneurs and business owners really loved using their Apple devices at home because being a business owner, they're probably more affluent. They were able to afford the nicest new iPhone as it came out every year. They were a bit of a status symbol when they first came out before every single person had one. And so a business owner would buy an iPhone first, and then they'd probably buy a Mac computer. And what we would see happening was entrepreneurs bringing their Mac computers into the workspace and saying to us, the IT consultants, hey, can you please make this work for me? And so we would then have to connect it up to the Microsoft operating system and connect it to Office and all those kind of things. What ended up happening was the Microsoft Office application suite on the Mac was not fantastic, let's just say it that way. And so it was very good and very easy to switch a customer over to using Google Workspace because the online documents worked a treat. As long as you had a browser, you were able to get the latest version of the documents and they all worked great online. But also, it also meant that you could sync it up with your Apple devices and sign into Gmail easily as well. So what that started to do was build an alliance between Google and Apple. All of a sudden you had these two businesses working together nicely and the two product suites starting to work together nicely as well. Some of the larger corporates started rolling out Apple computers because they were easier to wipe and manage remotely. There's some pretty cool remote management and cloning software tools for them as well. And being a much more stable operating system because Mac is actually Linux or Unix based, you were able to, as an IT department, manage less issues. And anyone who works in IT knows if you can manage the problems and if you can reduce the number of potential problems that come up, then your life is much easier. And so what that did, the introduction of some Apple hardware with the executives and then, interoperating between the Google ecosystem meant that it started to break the mold in businesses of going all in on Microsoft. Companies started to consider using Google and started to, open up to more employee choice in different areas of the business. And so both of these started to help kind of like grow each other. Now, when an organization was all in on Microsoft, right? Let's say they had one particular application that actually absolutely had to be run on the desktop, or maybe it only integrated with Microsoft Outlook. Well, then it made sense for everyone to stick with PCs in an organization. But for the companies that decided to make the switch over to Google Workspace because they were already using Macs, it was easier to use Google. They liked the one-click, less buttons, but the right buttons approach, which resonates a lot with Apple users and the Google suite. Well, businesses started making that switch over to Apple, and we then started seeing businesses that would be exclusively Apple machines and then run everything on Workspace. Now, the piece de resistance, the final piece to tie this all together, was when Google finally created a directory product inside their Google Workspace. Now, initially this was just called Google's Active Directory Sync, and you would synchronize to a directory product like Active Directory, or you could even synchronize it to Open Directory running on a Mac server. And what that would do was start to manage authentication for the end computers in your business. And so that meant that you no longer had to run a Microsoft server. If you wanted to, you could run a Mac server. But eventually Google have now, just in the last couple of years, released a directory product which connects directly to your machines. So you can actually sign into your local Mac and PC machines using your Google Workspace accounts. And what that's starting to do is really turn your machines into, kind of like Chromebooks. They're starting to be managed centrally by the Google ecosystem without the need for another directory server. So where does all this end up? What we find is time and time again, once someone switches to Google Workspace and they start to get used to working in the browser, working online, they have less use for doing things on the desktop and less reason to open up desktop-based applications. And so there's a very clear switch over to the Mac ethos of things are simple, things just work, and there's one button clicks. We're seeing a massive, massive growth spurt in Chrome devices right across all of our Workspace customers, but it's not going away anytime soon, that big influence of Macs in the small business and the enterprise space. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you'd like to learn more about business technology, make sure you check out our channel, hit that subscribe button. If you like this content, give us a thumbs up. If you've got any questions or comments, drop them down below. I'd love to have a chat with you there. Remember, if you're a Google Workspace customer and you're not yet a subscriber to itGenius, we'll click the link below to transfer in, and you can transfer your billing to us, get access to a bunch of free resources for your Google account, as well as some free support and an account check. See you in the next one.